Okay, so hello and welcome to the roundtable, The Humans in the Loop, Are We the Weakest Link in the Chain? We want to discuss the recurring narrative in cybersecurity that the humans are potentially the weakest link in the chain, that no matter what experts do to protect systems, it's us that are the weakest link in protecting systems from attack. So joining us for this conversation are Professor Luca Vigano, the head of Cybersecurity Group at the Department of Informatics at King's College London. Dr. Sally Marlow, Broadcaster and Public Engagement Fellow at King's College London. Hello. Antajuan Scott, Head of Programming at Michigan State University Science Gallery Detroit, which is currently hosting the Tracked and Traced exhibition, which we at the ODI have co-commissioned a work, fairlyintelligent.tech for, and the artist for that is speaking at a roundtable this afternoon, Machines Are Learning. And Alistair Gentry, artist and creator of DocsBox TrustBot and former artist in residence from the ODI Data as Culture programme. So welcome speakers, it's brilliant to have you all here, and welcome to all the audience as well. So I'd like to kick off with a question for Luca, which is, in 2019, Luca, you brought together an interdisciplinary group of researchers, including me, Sally, and Alistair, to challenge the common perception in cybersecurity that we, the humans, are the weakest link in the chain. And you specifically wanted to consider this from within a cross-discipline context and pulling in perspectives from the much wider sciences, so cross-discipline in a science sense, but cross-discipline in a practice sense as well, bringing together art and various different fields of thinking, psychology. Could you say a bit more about what inspired you and why you thought this was so important to your research?
Of course. First of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look very much forward to the rest of the panel and to the interaction with the audience. I think the starting point was the answer to the question that you asked. Yes, humans are the weakest link. That's unavoidable. On the other hand, I wanted to challenge precisely the last statement. So is it really unavoidable? And interestingly, if you ask people working in security like myself, you know, I'm cybersecurity expert, let's say so, or at least I'm an academic doing research in cybersecurity. The typical answer that you will get is that, well, we're doing everything that we can to make sure that the systems are secure, and we expect that the human users will play their part in ensuring that the system and the interaction between the human and the system occurs really in a secure way. We give them guidelines, we teach them how to interact with the systems and what is secure and what is not secure. So humans should really stick to their part of the contract and really ensure that this interaction is secure. On the other hand, if you talk to the humans, well, most of them will say, well, wait a moment, I didn't really sign that contract, or at least I'm not aware of all the clauses and the paragraphs in that contract. And in many cases, they're written in a language that I don't explain. And that was precisely the starting point for the project and the collaboration, because talking to Sally, who was my partner in crime in coming up with the project, was really the idea was really to say, okay, how can we change the narrative? Well, we need to change the language. It doesn't help to tell users that they are idiots, that they should behave like we tell them to do, because they won't, simply because they don't understand, or simply because they don't have the time to understand, or in many cases, simply because they don't have the capabilities to understand. So we need to find a different language, and we need to find a language that somehow breaks the barrier and takes away a little bit the fear that many human users have when interacting with systems. And so we thought, well, we need to, in order to find that language, we cannot just use the standard language of computer science. We need to bring in other influences in that language. And this is why the need for a multidisciplinary project. And this is why the need for a project that involves also art and artworks, because they can make the process of understanding much simpler for humans, and they can actually invite them into the world of let's make the system secure in a much friendlier way, in a much more engaging way.
Thank you so much. I want to come back to Sally to talk about her role in this, but also I want to turn to Antoine Scott now, because when we talked about this earlier on, you talked about challenging the question about whether we're the weakest link in the chain from a really different perspective. You pointed out that the human qualities we have, such as fear, hate, our desire to reach certain social status, which we kind of bake into our technologies, perhaps that maybe we are the weakest link, even though that might not be in the way the original phrase was intended. And I wonder if you can say a bit more about that. And I don't know if you want to refer to some of the artworks you've currently got on display at the Science Gallery Detroit in your Tract and Trace show.
Yes, absolutely. So when thinking about the influence of the human as it relates to our algorithms and our technologies, it is definitely evidence that the human's influence is what is often what's wrong with those technologies. And we're so fortunate to be able to interrogate those questions via art at Science Gallery. And with the exhibition Tract and Trace, there are several works that utilize the technologies that are presented, such as facial recognition technologies, in a work called Boogaloo Bias. And that work is a training exercise essentially for facial recognition technologies that utilizes characters from 1980s film, villains often from those films, and correlates your image to one of those villains' images. And I think that when we are thinking about the use of facial recognition technology in policing and through our criminal justice system, those types of misunderstandings are big issues and real problems for many people from marginalized backgrounds, and for many people who do not have the resources to work their way from these systems. I also think about the marginalization of sex workers on social media. We have a work by Lena Chin and a group of her collaborators called Only Bands. It is a game that walks you through a series of prompts that a person whom may or may not be a part of a sex working profile would come to face with. And there's things such as blackouts for people on social media that happen without any human involvement, simply because the image has set off a algorithm response. And it happens to people who are just posting pictures at the beach. I think that there's biases that are inherently human that our technologies take on. I think fear and hate, or wanting to police someone's body because it doesn't look right to you, are often things that we have to come to face with and are really ills of our society. And I think misunderstandings across our society. And I hope we can bring and raise more questions about why these things exist. And a lot of the answers is, well, there aren't enough people that are diverse who are creating these technologies. Diversity is a big issue within the science community as a whole, but speaking specifically as our technologies become more a part of our lives and adapting to society, there needs to be more people creating. There needs to be more people interrogating. And I'm happy to have these works in Tract and Trace.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Antoine. So this is a really nice segue directly to Alistair, building on what Antoine said about bringing in much more diverse voices, and also what Luca has said about, if we want to change the narrative, we have to change the language. You developed DocsBox TrustBot through a residency with us at the ODI, but when Luca and Sally invited me to be a researcher with them on their project exploring cybersecurity, I said, this has to include Alistair. So you then became part of the team as an artist, using DocsBox as a really unusual research mechanism. Would you like to say something about that?
Yeah, DocsBox, yeah, for those who don't know, is a kind of an AI puppet. It's I call it tech drag because it's It's kind of enacting the characteristics of technology without actually being technology. It's dressing as technology, because what it really is me behind the scenes. It's drawing attention to a lot of the things that are supposedly AI have a lot of kind of behind the scenes, the usual people that work behind the scenes and don't get credit. It's marginalized people, it's people in the developing world, it's people on precarious job contracts doing the actual work. So part of my research at the ODI was finding all of these stories about how the data that accumulates around our lives has wildly differing effects on people from different backgrounds. So you can be using the same service, but it's much more risky to you using that service, again, predictably, if you are from a marginalized background, if you're a person of color, if you're LGBTQ, so the impacts are not distributed equally, just as the benefits of data and social networks are not distributed equally either. So and one of the things I think that relates to this research project particularly is that from having had the opportunity, luckily, to do this work with hundreds of people before I came onto this project, I could see from my own experiences with all of these individuals how much many of them changed just in the course of that 10-minute conversation, just simply by not treating them like idiots and presenting them with the information, and just even presenting them fairly neutrally with the information that they need in order to make a more of an informed decision about how they interact with data and apps. So it's quite a superficial conversation, but even that I saw could be quite transformative. Just the responses from people were amazing. People very often say, laughing, saying I'm horrified, or just horrified, and kind of asking, what can I do? So I think it's really important for artists to ask these questions, but I think artists are also they don't have to be, but I think artists can be part of the solution too, because they have a unique way of kind of getting in there, in a way that other people are a bit scared to do, like that's the work that Antajuan was talking about. Just an artist who's interested in engaging with sex work is not necessarily bound by academic kind of boundaries or strictures, so you can just say, yeah, this is interesting, I have a moral position and I'm not ashamed of it, so I'm gonna put that forward. So
and a unique perspective. I'd like to jump into Sally now. And Sally, as a research scientist, you are with Luca the joint PI on the Cryptoculture 3.0 project, and you've been really looking at how Alistair as a performance artist has had an impact on the participants who we've interviewed, with interviews constructed by you and your team around what they know about cybersecurity. Can you tell us more about what you've observed in this quite unusual research process, and what sort of questions it's raised about data and visual data, as well as data collected in many different ways?
So this has been a fascinating project for me, because I came to it knowing absolutely nothing about cybersecurity. I'm a psychologist, I work in mental health, but I have been working for a long time with the arts and mental health. So I know how the arts can bridge divides. And when we're talking about marginalized communities, as Antajuan was, when we're talking about trying to find a language and not treating people like idiots, as Alistair is, that resonates with me a lot when we see people in, for example, mental health services, where they need to understand what is going on for them. They need to understand what their experience is, and they need to understand that not from the expert position, not from the person who's using words which are meaningless and don't speak to their experience, but they need to be able to understand it so they can make informed decisions in mental health, just as they do in their use of digital, the whole of digital, actually. So what was very interesting for me was seeing those similarities in the research methodology, if you like, and also as a research scientist. I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm a research scientist that looks at mental health. The interesting thing for me was who gets to create knowledge, who's allowed to do that. the scientists, the cybersecurity experts, the people with professor and doctor in front of their name, or the artists, or everybody, and the people actually using various types of digital interfaces in their own worlds, which is everybody. So I can see somebody's put the word co-creation in the chat, and that's a really interesting concept, because actually co-creation in mental health is becoming a bit of a dirty word, because it's quite easy to say you're co-creating something, but you're not. And that's what we wanted to avoid in this project. So onto your question, Hannah, that was a huge amount of context, but onto your question, what did I observe? Well, I was observing as a psychiatrist, but also, sorry, as a psychologist, I'm not a psychiatrist, but also with my mental health scientist hat on. And I think there was some psychological constructs which were very interesting, like cognitive dissonance, when people hold two opposing positions at the same time. So somebody will say, we see this most actually in a lot of people who are heavy smokers, who say, oh yeah, I know smoking is really bad for me, but somewhere they believe it's never going to be bad for them personally. And particularly around the passwords, oh yeah, I think nobody's going to guess my passwords. I think they're really secure. And then when you probe that, actually they know their passwords are really not secure and that anybody could get in. So that was interesting. There was stuff to do with learning and attention. Again, these are psychological constructs that we've discovered and discovered a lot about over the years. But I think one of the most surprising things for me was the depth of emotion in terms of the engagement with the docs box intervention, as we might call it, in the psychological world, provocation, as we might call it in the artistic world. But those who were actually experiencing DocSpot their emotions were almost visceral sometimes. You know, it was, and to the humans in the loop, are we the weakest link? It touched on something which is very, very, very human, and something which I think that as psychologists, research scientists, cybersecurity experts, it's really difficult for us to get at. And this is where the arts come in, and this is where people like Alistair and Antajuan and yourself, Hannah, can really help us try and get to understanding what the language could be to include as many people as possible.
Thanks very much. I'd love to get Luca to respond to that, but first I want to go to the questions we're getting from the floor. So first from Giovanni Leone, who says, is not the main issue that digital technology has yet to be evolved enough to represent the world in data and algorithms? Bias, broken processes, and poor UX. Is that not just a sign of low maturity? Very interesting in terms of data doubles, data doppelgangers there. Do you want to step in, Luca?
Oh, that's a tough question. I can try to step in. I'm not sure it's a sign of low maturity. I think that, or maybe it is, but maybe it is something that we have to live with. And the reason for that is that technology is evolving so rapidly that I don't think that we can often talk about mature technologies. In particular, the users are also evolving, because let's consider, for instance, what has happened to us over the last 18 months. You know, the fact that we have moved many of our activities online has created a huge number of new interesting cybersecurity questions, ranging from, you know, how do you teach someone to move their activities onto Zoom, Hopin, or Teams, or whatever, with all the security issues that entails, to actually how do you ensure that that much of the world is not cut out from this move to online. You know, we often tend to think, oh yeah, of course, people had to adapt, but we often forget that in many cases, people were not in the position to adapt simply because they didn't have the technology at their disposal, or they didn't have the mature technology at their disposal. So I think that I would agree with Giovanni that, you know, it is a sign of low maturity, but on the other hand, I also think that much in the same way as my answer to the question, are humans the weakest link, is yes. I would answer this question by saying yes, but then we need to find ways to engage with this not mature technology in a way that is still to some extent secure. We can't wait for it to be mature before we do something.
Thank you very much. We have another question from Julie Freeman, which I'd like to put to Antoine, which she says, all well said that when we invent a new thing, we invent a language to go with it. Is it important that the two things are separate, that the people inventing the language are not the inventor of the thing, i.e. data experts shouldn't be describing data things?
Well, I think that we need people who are of a intersectional experience. I can't help but to have considered that what the technology is most lacking is empathy. I think that there's a workshop that we recently presented at Science Gallery in collaborations with the Stamps Gallery at the University of Michigan with the transdisciplinary artist Stephanie Dinkins, and it's called Binary Calculations Are Inadequate to Assess Us. And it utilizes the creation of data sets that are actually empathy driven, to think of things that like what color are you feeling now? It's the first color. It's the first question. And for someone like Sally, I think that is probably a good question to ask in regards to understanding someone's mood or understanding someone's perspective in that moment. And I think once we begin to ask the right questions in these algorithms and to actually think about the totality and the intersectional experience of others, with also the inclusion of a pathway for people who are from an intersectional experience to become the data scientist, to become the computer scientist, I believe we will begin to see a technology that will evolve. So speaking to Luca's fact, I'm not sure if I would also say that it's broken. I will say that there is bias for certain. And I would hope that we are having this conversation and people out there who are in positions to create and to make opportunities do, because that is when we'll be able to actually see a more technocratic, experience.
Thank you so much. We have two more questions from Tanya Duarte and Rohini Devasher, which I'll come to in a minute, but I wonder if anyone else would like to respond to Antoine's comments. Alistair?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, based on both what Luca and Antoine said, humans are not mature. It's just, we're proving every day that humans are not mature because we can't get along with each other. We're still fussing about people who look different or have different bodies and different faces and different experiences than us. It's a constant source of friction. So humans are not mature. So I think it's a lot to expect that the things we make are mature either. So, and again, I think that's why it's so important for us to constantly be pushing against these boundaries and especially if we are marginalized people ourselves, but everybody as well, to be thinking about how mature are you, and again, technology is not neutral. Our technologies are not mature because we're not mature. Our technologies are biased because we're biased. So, the idea, and again, this is a huge problem that I've talked about a lot and written about a lot, just this kind of Silicon Valley mentality of, oh, I just make the technology. It's not my business what happens with it. It is your business what happens with it, because your biases, for a start, are embedded in that technology, sometimes without you even knowing it. So I think it's very much the business of the people making these technologies to open these things out to criticism and, constructive criticism and unconstructive criticism from the people who are really impacted.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Tanya Duarte's question, which was, is there anything published from this? Excuse me. Is there anything published from this project, Sally? I'll put this to you. Can anyone recommend any literature on the psychological aspects of interacting with art to facilitate understanding of technology? Luca, you've answered this in the chat, but maybe Sally can say something, and then Luca, you can say a bit more, please. Thank you.
So we haven't published yet, but we will be. So watch this space. Academic publishing, this is one of the other places where academia is really not always the best medium to explore anything, frankly. Takes forever. It takes forever to write the damn papers. It takes forever for people to review the damn papers, and then it takes forever for the journals to publish the damn papers. You know, one of my other hats is I work for the BBC, where I make podcasts and radio documentaries. And it's so brilliant just being able to get things straight out into the world. And in academic circles, it doesn't work like that. We are going to publish the results for this, though, and yeah, as I say, watch this space. Luca, you can say more about your work on this, though, not just on this project, because you've done quite a lot, haven't you?
I have. Indeed, I've tried to summarize my work in 3 papers that have appeared in the last couple of years on how to use existing artworks to explain cybersecurity. So this started a few years ago when I wrote a roadmap paper called Explainable Security, in which I showed how actually explaining security is even more difficult than explaining AI. Nowadays, people talk a lot about explainable AI, which means basically AI systems should explain their decisions. And then I described how explainable security is more complicated because it's not enough to explain a decision. You also need to show that the explanation is secure, that by means of explaining, you don't actually create a vulnerability in the system. And I gave a number of examples why that was the case. So I found explainable security to be a fascinating topic, and I started addressing it using existing artworks. So, you know, using popular movies, popular novels, music, and more, to try and explain cybersecurity notions and try to categorize them, you know, ranging from films about hackers, for instance, which in some cases are tremendously inventive and hackers are superhumans with superhuman powers. In some cases they are real, but in most cases they're really just there to create a distance between the audience and the subject of the film. But there are also other films which are much closer to reality. And of course, what is more interesting is to find the metaphors, to find the tropes in existing artworks so that people can understand, aha, this notion might be challenging. You know, for instance, a standard example, talking about anonymity is difficult because people don't really understand how you can be anonymous online, that you need a crowd of people doing the same thing. But if you give them an example, and I use, for instance, the I'm Spartacus scene in the movie Spartacus, where everybody stands up and says, I'm Spartacus, and thereby protect the real Spartacus, that is a very good way to make people understand, well, the mathematical definition, the computer science definition might be challenging, but the intuition behind the notion is something that I, non-expert, I'm very well comfortable with. And so I tried to write that up in those papers. But of course, as Sally was saying, the project was focused on the intervention around DocsBox, and this is what we are hoping to publish soon. But as Sally said, that soon is a relative notion of time in academia.
Well, time is relative. Luca, it's great to hear more about that. And your Spartacus example appeared in one of the other roundtables earlier, actually. In fact, I think it appeared while Alistair was performing DocsBox. People made comments. But what I wanted to say about that is DocsBox was created during a residency at the ODI. But in fact, it has evolved through this research project, working with you, Luca and Sally, and your participants in this research. Alistair has rescripted DocsBox in relation to the research process and the findings of the research, which is a really exciting process. We're all trying on for size. None of us have done this exactly like this before, but it's really fruitful and really, really wonderful to be able to do it. We have another question from Martin Dow. Oh, Sally, do you want to jump in before I read the next question?
Yeah, just to come in on the back of that, but also on the previous question about maturity and humans not being mature. I absolutely agree with what Alistair said, that we're not mature and that holds us back in a lot of ways. But in this research project, and when we're using the arts, and actually in mental health and mental illness, not being mature can sometimes be a good thing. So if you think about the power of play, that Jungian concept. And I'm not a witness for psychoanalysis. That's not what I'm here to do. But you know, there are some things about play which I think have been very, very important, and to have a playful approach grounded in these different disciplines in this project, I think has been really fruitful.
Thank you. I'd love to ask Antajuan to respond to that as well. All your work at Science Gallery in Detroit.
Yeah, I think that what Sally said just hits the nail on the head. You know, I think that we have many ways of intervening and like interacting with technologies that need to be explored. We recently hosted a workshop by the performance artist Laura Alcorn, and she created a workshop that essentially is about tricking biometric surveillance. So creating like these really wonky outfits out of Mylar and putting rocks in your shoes to augment your gait. That there is ways to, you know, interact with technology to also create anonymity, as Luca was pointing to, that actually allows you to, you know, see the world differently. I think that there is a uniformity that is really edging us in the wrong direction. I think that like we need to just split it open and see what's inside. I think there's a big mess that needs to be made. And I think this uniformity within our technologies and within our existence as people on Earth is really like disrupting our relationships.
And on that, the magic in science is often on the variability. It's not on the mean. It's not on the averages. It's not on when sometimes it's that variability that actually gives you the answer. And I think that's really important.
Thank you so much. I'll jump away from that into this question that we've had from Martin Dow. What steps are being taken to introduce these points and have them worked through with children? I don't know if any of you know the answer to that.
Well,
Alistair.
firstly, I can say that previously, when it was live, I had it. DocSpox does work with children, you know, usually with their parents alongside. But yeah, it's like children, because I mean, increasingly young children, they're sitting with their tablets, they're sitting with, you know, screens and interactive apps. You know, they're often used to, you know, they're the babysitter of children sometimes, as television was for people of our age. But they're interacting quite actively with these things. So yeah, DocSpox can engage with those kind of very young people as well. And I think it's going to be increasingly important that people, just as people should be being taught civics and how their democratic political systems work in their countries when they're children should also be being taught data ethics and where the data is going that they're creating in their lives as children now. It's just wholly irresponsible that children are not being taught that at the moment.
Yes, they're so tech savvy. They jump onto the internet, they download everything free they can get their hands on, and it's it's a very unequal playing field, right?
Yeah, so I think it's something that I'm definitely really interested in doing, and kind of finding ways, again, as Luca said right at the top, to find that language to talk to people, which is not talking down to people, or including children, but you know, finding that language that really makes sense to all people, so that they can have that agency and make the right choices for themselves, you know, and to work within these systems. And again, as Antajuan said, to kind of make these systems as childlike or black or queer or whatever as they want them and need them to be, and that they're not at the moment.
Yes, exactly. Luca, you also wanted to respond to this.
Yeah, because I find it fascinating. Actually, you know, there are a lot of people, including myself, trying to do research on cybersecurity for the different ages. So, you know, talking about cybersecurity with seniors is certainly very different from talking about cybersecurity with children and with all the people in between. So we do need different languages. We do need different techniques. what is interesting is that, as you were saying, Hannah, and as Alistair then also pointed out, children are much more reactive and much more comfortable with many things. In some cases, also with many of the vulnerabilities, and they do tend to download everything without thinking whether this might be, a virus, a worm, or something dangerous. But interestingly, there are plenty of examples in the children's worlds that relate to cybersecurity. So, for instance, one of the typical examples that I make, there is a Peppa Pig episode, which is called The Secret Club, where basically you become a member of the club by saying the password out loud, and to make sure that the secret club is protected, the password changes every time, which is basically a one-time password. And it's a very, very complex notion to actually implement for real, but children seem to be very comfortable with it and actually seem to like the idea that it changes every time. It's fun. And it does provide additional security. And so, for instance, on Thursday, I will be giving a talk at King's College London, where we are organizing a festival of disruptive thinking. And the talk that I'll be giving is titled Cybersecurity, Nicolas Cage and Peppa Pig, really trying to capture the work that I've been doing around using popular artworks to explain cybersecurity. But to answer the question, sorry, I've been very long again, but to answer the question, I think we need dedicated studies to consider the different ages and the different interventions that we can do with children, with seniors and the like. We haven't done that yet, but I think it's one of the logical next steps in order to have really concrete data to work on, rather than just, quoting Peppa Pig.
And I think there's a wider point, back to context again, and I can see in the chat Ian's put some questions in, which raises all sorts of issues to me about safeguarding with children. And it's a very real worry, safeguarding of children online, a very, very real worry. There are places, though, domains where, not digital domains necessarily, but places where people have really thought through safeguarding of children, and mental health research is one of those, where the ethics have been absolutely tested and tested and tested to make sure that we get it right and we don't go into anything without a full belt and braces set of research ethics and safeguarding protocols. And I'm just wondering if the digital world is late to the party, but could learn from not only the world of mental health, but from educational settings and lots of disciplines out there. I'm just, because the digital world is not really my world, as I think I'm making it quite clear, it just strikes me that there's a lot elsewhere that isn't being brought in somehow, which could be.
Yeah, and just to add very quickly, I think in my work, in DocsBox, I get more informed consent from my users than Facebook does, I think, because I actually kind of engage with them and actually ask them directly, are you okay with this? How do you feel? Is this what you want? Which is something that Facebook, for example, doesn't do. And
we had to get research ethics to do our project.
Yes. Yeah, and this also relates to the opacity of a lot of this technology. That often people would have more of an opinion if they were asked at the right moment, I think. I've got some jittering going on with my screen. If someone wants to talk over me, please do.
I can pick up that a bit as well. I think Sally was just saying that for this project to go ahead, you need to have absolutely, in an academic context, you have to have absolutely watertight consent and make sure that everybody, it's a completely consensual and fully understood experience, which I think it's something which is still quite alien to the tech world. Actually, it's like it doesn't occur to them to seek that kind of consent and that kind of create that kind of safeguarding for the experience you have as a human being in those networks.
It used to be quite alien to the research community as well. And then in the 1970s, there were the Kennedy hearings, which protected the rights of those taking part in any sort of scientific research. And that could be social sciences. You know, it doesn't necessarily mean you're being given drugs to see whether they cure something or not. But the research community was late to this too. And there were some absolute atrocities before we woke up to it. You know, it feels so much like reinventing the wheel. You know, when we look at what we already know about how easy it is for the power hierarchy of, say, researcher and participant, say Facebook or Meta or whatever it wants to be called this week, the artist formerly known as Prince, and the users. It feels like this isn't just about the digital. These issues are fundamental, and there's something about the digital world that means they've been sort of hived off in a way that they shouldn't have been.
Yeah, and of course the thing is, you're talking about atrocities that are committed in like scientific research, which they were, again, particularly against Black and brown people and LGBT people and women. We're seeing those social media atrocities right now, like, you know, the whipping up of genocide against the Rohingya people in Myanmar is just one example. One that I researched myself was the hounding of gay men in Eastern Europe, places like Chechnya, where their social networks were and are being used to round them up and commit crimes against them, to murder them in some cases. So we're already seeing those atrocities, but we're not, I think, seeing a reaction from these companies to kind of bring in the kind of ethics that we need there.
Yeah, I think you hit on the right word there, Alistair, ethics. I think that there is an issue within the ethics of our technologies because of how they're created in silos and, you know, and how they're tested in silos. And I think that when it comes to understanding like their practice and their standards, I think we need to be more inquisitive about why certain things exist within it and who it is affecting. I think that, like, you know, I can't, like, you know, be remiss in terms of like stating the fact that as exploring an exhibition on surveillance and specifically technologies within surveillance, there are many, I think, exchanges that we as users give up because we want access, and we want access to certain communities. And so that could be, you know, people who are wanting to connect with families or friends in places where there's like tons of political turmoil. Or it could be someone wanting to find a partner or love on an app, but that app is weaponized by someone who has hate. You know, I think there is, like, you know, the end user is what we also need to interrogate a bit. So there is also the creator, but there's also the end user. And I think there is weaponizing of many technologies by its users. And I think Facebook is a place where we've seen that happen globally. And I believe that, like, you know, I mean, I think it just happens in many ways and we just don't ever see it on the newsreel.
And these are all reasons why humans end up being the weakest link, because they are attracted precisely by those reasons, by that kind of payoff. And they don't realize that in doing so, they are opening up potentially the systems to vulnerabilities. And I would not want to blame them for that. It's not their fault.
Hello, I am the weakest link in the chain. My computer just crashed. Apologies for missing what sounds like was a really great moment in this roundtable. Thank you to everybody who's joined us to listen in and to involve themselves in the chat and to ask us lots of questions. We've gone over time a little bit. We can go a little bit longer if anyone has any burning questions. I can see that Erinma Ochu has asked a question. Luca, did you answer this already, Luca? When you consider the need,
I answered it in the chat, but not on the panel. Maybe I can say very quickly.
Yes. let me just finish the question.
Yeah.
When you consider the need for studies of different ages, are you talking about literacy levels or something else?
Both. So literacy level, of course, plays a role, and of course the cultural context will play a role, and geography will play a role as well, because that is part of the context. But mainly it is the attitude that will change. So seniors will tend to be much more conservative, much more worried, because in a sense they have more to lose, or they feel inadequate. Whereas children and teenagers will tend to be much bolder, because they feel they are technology natives, and perhaps don't understand the consequences of their actions. So that I believe is the most fascinating difference, rather than, of course, the literacy level, which will also play a role.
Thank you so much. Does anybody have anything burning they want to conclude with, or any parting comment? Alistair?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about this we've kind of looped around this subject basically, but when I was making DocsBox, one of the things that I did to make it effective, to achieve the aims I wanted to do, was to look at how apps and services manipulate us, the way they do the things that they do to us, the way they create loops of addiction and reward and all of these things. So DocsBox is actually using those patterns to kind of try and sort of jam a spanner into that system, even if it's only in my own small way. And I think, again, as Antoine alluded to earlier, I think it's really important, again, particularly for people who are marginalized, to have the opportunity and to have the wherewithal to do that. It's so important. Yeah.
People who might be able to book themselves a live encounter with DocsBox, if you go to the Copy That booth in the showcase section, there's a button where you can click to book a slot with DocsBox, if there are any left. Sally, did you want to say any final words?
Just thank you for introducing me to this world, which hasn't. And Hannah, you started this some time ago. Luca, Alistair, and now Antajuan. I'm learning loads from you, and yeah, thank you for including me in the panel.
Thank you so much. We've all been really able to learn so much from your insights. And Antajuan, final words.
Yes, I'd just like to say that art can be a powerful tool in the critiquing and creating of ethical and informing technologies. I hope that we continue to have a collaborative engagement of people who are interdisciplinary that will help us really answer the questions that our society needs most. And that is, when will it work? And I just say thank you again, Hannah, for this invitation. And it was such a pleasure being here with all of you. Thank
you all so much. Luca, do you want to say anything else, or do you feel talked out?
I don't feel talked out, but I think that the words of Alistair, Antajuan, and Sally are the perfect way to end the discussion, namely DocsBox and interdisciplinarity. We need more of both.
Brilliant. So please follow up Luca and Sally's links. Please follow up Antoine's work with the Science Gallery Detroit Tracked and Traced exhibition. Please go to the Copy That booth, where you can see some documentation of our exhibition, Copy That: Surplus Data in an Age of Repetitive Duplication, which is the exhibition through which we commissioned DocsBox originally. And do book yourself on a session with DocsBox if you can today. Thank you, and thank you all for coming. And we'll say goodbye. And speakers, I'll meet you in the post green room. Thank you. Goodbye.